So, I recently had to deal with a situation that involved my property, an HOA, and some really entitled neighbors who thought they could use my land as a shortcut. Let me start from the beginning. I moved into my house a little over a year ago. It's a great property, quiet, secluded, with a nice stretch of land that borders a community with an HOA. When I bought it, I didn't think I'd have any issues, but that was before I realized just how entitled some of the people in that HOA can be. You see, my property has a narrow strip of land that leads into one of the streets of the HOA neighborhood. It's not paved, but it's clear enough to look like a road. In fact, it's so clear that people started using it as a shortcut. At first, I thought it was just a leftover from the previous owners. Maybe they used it for something, or perhaps it was an old access point. But then, things got weird. I started seeing tire tracks on it, and before I knew it, I woke up one weekend to see a bunch of cars driving through it, cutting across my property to get into the neighborhood. I figured it was just a one-off, but it kept happening. It wasn't just one or two cars either. It became a regular thing. Every few days, I'd see cars turning onto my property and driving through it like it was a public road. Now, I'm not a confrontational person, but this started to really bug me. It's not just the fact that they were trespassing, but the way they acted like it was no big deal. I'd stand outside and wave at them, trying to let them know this wasn't a public road, but most of the drivers just ignored me or gave me a look like, "What's the big deal?" At first, I didn't do much. I just figured it was a one-time thing and I'd get used to it. But then one morning, I came home from work to see a car turning too wide onto the strip, and when it did, the tires spun out, tearing up a good chunk of my yard. That was the last straw for me. I called up the HOA, explained the situation, and asked if they could do something about it. You'd think they'd want to keep things under control, right? Well, apparently not. They told me, since the strip of land wasn't part of their jurisdiction, they couldn't do anything about it. That was when I knew I'd have to take matters into my own hands. I started planning for a fence. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for someone else to fix this. I went ahead and hired a contractor to put up a sturdy gate with a fence around the property. I also put up no trespassing signs along the strip. I didn't want anyone claiming ignorance if they got caught on my property. From my online research, I'd read that HOA boards often ignore situations like these, especially when they aren't directly involved in the property management. Many homeowners in similar situations often find themselves stuck when dealing with an HOA that doesn't act or enforce its own rules, and that seemed to be the case here. But that's when things got interesting. Less than a week after the fence went up, I came home one Saturday to see a car parked by the gate, honking its horn. And who do I see standing outside the car? The most entitled woman I've ever had the misfortune of dealing with. Let's call her Karen. Karen was blaring her horn, waiting for me to come out and open the gate. I could tell she was angry before she even said a word. As soon as I stepped outside, she got out of her car and marched right toward me. I had no idea who she was at first, but she didn't waste any time letting me know. She was clearly not happy with me taking control of the situation. Based on my research about HOAs and the entitlement some members feel, I wasn't too shocked to find out she was part of the HOA board. I'd heard plenty of stories about HOA members abusing their power, thinking they could enforce rules on private property that don't belong to them. It seemed like Karen might be one of those people who felt entitled to do whatever she wanted on land that wasn't even hers. She didn't waste any time. "Are you the one that put up this gate? You need to open it now." "I'm already late," she said, with this look of complete disdain on her face. I was taken aback at first, unsure of how to respond to someone so blatantly rude. But then I remembered what I had read about HOA disputes. People like Karen will often feel entitled to whatever they want because they're used to being in control. It's not uncommon for homeowners in HOA communities to experience problems with neighbors trying to take advantage of their property rights, especially when there's no clear enforcement of boundaries. At that moment, I realized I had to be firm with her, or else this would keep happening. So, there I was, standing in front of this woman who clearly wasn't used to being told no. I wasn't going to back down. I calmly told her, "This is my property, and I don't want anyone driving through it. You're trespassing." Of course, she didn't take that well. Her face turned red with anger as she shot back, You can't block this road. I'm on the HOA board, and we've been using this access point for years. You have no right to stop us. I'll have you know, the HOA will hear about this, and you'll regret it. I tried to remain calm. I'd done my research on HOA rules, and it was clear to me that, even though Karen was part of the board, she had no right to tell me what to do with my property. I explained to her that the strip of land wasn't a public road. It was part of my property, and I had every right to restrict access. But Karen wasn't hearing any of it. She kept demanding that I open the gate, her voice rising with each word. You'll regret this. You don't know who you're messing with, she said, taking out her phone and dialing something, likely to make her complaint known to the HOA. I wasn't sure what she thought she could accomplish with a phone call, but I wasn't about to entertain her tantrum. Then it happened. She actually called the police. It's not uncommon for HOA conflicts to escalate in bizarre ways. Some people feel that if they're on the HOA board, they're above the law or can somehow control the neighborhood's rules, even if it involves private property. That's exactly what Karen was trying to do. Use her HOA position to intimidate me into letting her use my land for free. From my research, I knew that the HOA couldn't control anything outside its neighborhood, and that included my property. So, when the police arrived, I was confident they'd back me up. The officer who approached me was polite but clearly confused about the situation. We got a call about someone blocking a road, he said, looking at the gate I had put up. Is this a public road? No, officer, I replied. This is my property, and I put up the gate to stop people from using it as a shortcut. The person who called you, Karen, was trespassing on private property. She's trying to use it like a public road, but it's not. I showed him the property map I had obtained from the township to prove that the land was mine. I'd made sure the fence construction adhered to the property lines, and everything was legal. The officer looked at the map and nodded. Okay, I see. That's clear. This is private property. I'll go speak to the other officer. I could hear Karen arguing with the other officer, but I wasn't too concerned. The officer came back to me, looking calm. I'm sorry, but she's been misinformed, he said. This isn't a public road, and you're within your rights to block access to it. I'm going to explain that to her. It seems like she didn't understand the situation. As he walked away, Karen was still shouting about how the HOA would come after me. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. The more she protested, the more ridiculous it sounded. In HOA conflicts like these, people often overestimate their authority. HOAs can impose rules within their community, but they have no jurisdiction over private property outside the neighborhood, especially when it comes to matters like trespassing. I knew that from the many cases I'd read about, people in similar situations had won court battles or simply forced the HOA to back off by standing their ground. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as the officers spoke to Karen. It was clear that they were on my side. But then Karen took things to the next level. As the officers finished their conversation with her, she came storming up to me, practically seething with anger. This isn't over, she hissed. I'm going to make sure the HOA takes action. You're going to regret doing this. You can't just block access to a road that's been used for years. I wasn't intimidated. I calmly responded, go ahead. But just know, this is my property, and I have every right to do this. If anyone tries to use it again, I'll call the police myself. The officers, now done with the situation, nodded in agreement. With that, Karen reluctantly left, but not without a final, dramatic glare. I couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction. The HOA's involvement was getting ridiculous, but I knew I'd done the right thing. Later that night, I checked the footage from my security cameras. Sure enough, I could see Karen's meltdown from earlier. Watching it back, I realized how absurd the whole thing had been. She acted like I was the one who was in the wrong, even though she was the one breaking the law. The next few days were eerily quiet. No more cars drove through my property, and Karen's threats didn't seem to be making much of an impact. I thought the situation had blown over, but of course this is an HOA story, so things were about to take a turn. About a week after the confrontation, I received a letter from the HOA. I hadn't expected it, but at the same time I wasn't surprised. It seemed like Karen had finally gone over my head, probably to other board members, and now the HOA was getting involved. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my actions, namely the fence and gate that blocked what they had called a public access point. I sat down with the letter in my hands and laughed a little. There was no way the HOA had any legal grounds to force me to take the gate down. They could try to pressure me, but I had researched everything thoroughly, and I wasn't about to back down. I made sure my property was in full compliance with the law and my rights were clear. The HOA couldn't touch that. The letter didn't make much sense anyway. The HOA was acknowledging that I owned the property, but they seemed to believe they had the right to control it just because people had been using the road for years. They even mentioned the community's needs, and how I was interfering with what they considered a long-standing shortcut. That was laughable. The HOA didn't own the land, and no amount of past usage made it a public road. I prepared for the meeting, though, just in case. I gathered all the evidence I'd collected, including the property lines, a map from the township, photos of the area, and the camera footage of Karen's initial outburst. I wasn't taking any chances. When the day of the meeting came, I drove over to the HOA office. The room was filled with board members who looked at me as if I were the villain in some neighborhood drama. I immediately spotted Karen sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed in a self-righteous posture. She looked smug, as if she already knew she had the upper hand. But I was ready. The meeting started with the board president introducing the issue. He briefly described how my fence was blocking access to the public road and how several neighbors had voiced concerns. Karen quickly added, "This is affecting all of us. That shortcut is the most convenient way to get into our neighborhood, and now we're stuck using the main road, which adds several extra minutes to our commute. I've been a member of this board for years, and we've never had any issues with this access point until now." I let her speak, but I knew she was just trying to create a sense of urgency and make it seem like I was causing widespread chaos. I raised my hand to speak, and the president nodded for me to proceed. "I understand your concerns, but the truth is, this isn't a public road," I said, standing firm. "I've done my homework. This strip of land is private property, and I have every right to block off access to it. It's not a shortcut, it's my land, and I don't want anyone using it without my permission. If any of you had done your homework, you'd know that the HOA has no jurisdiction outside of its own boundaries." There was a moment of silence in the room. Karen was visibly upset, but I could see that a few of the board members were starting to rethink their stance. They had no legal leg to stand on. Still, Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. She shot back, "This is absurd. Just because you have a piece of paper saying you own the land doesn't mean you can just mess with everyone's lives. We've been using that shortcut for years. You're causing unnecessary trouble." At this point, the other board members began to murmur among themselves. One asked, "Are we sure this is even within our jurisdiction?" Another board member added, "I don't think we can force him to do anything if it's his property. Karen, maybe we should focus on resolving this without escalating it further." I could feel the shift in the room. My stance was gaining traction. The more I explained that the HOA had no authority over private property, the more the board members seemed to agree. They were starting to realize that their position was weaker than they thought. Karen, however, was not having it. She stood up and slammed her hands on the table. "This isn't over. I'll take this to higher authorities. You'll regret letting him get away with this." The president raised his hand to calm the room, clearly trying to avoid further escalation. "Karen, I think we've discussed this enough for now. We'll need to review the legalities and talk with our attorney before making any further decisions. But for now, it seems we don't have much choice but to respect the property owner's rights." It was a small victory, but it felt like a big one. Karen wasn't done, though. I knew she'd keep pushing, but I was prepared for whatever came next. The HOA, however, seemed to be backing down, understanding that they were on shaky ground legally. After the meeting, things seemed to settle down for a while. The HOA had told Karen they would review the legalities, but I could tell from their hesitancy that they weren't eager to push the issue further. Karen, however, wasn't one to back off easily. Over the next few weeks, I received several more letters from the HOA, each one more aggressive than the last. They insisted I needed to restore public access, and suggested I remove the gate or risk further legal action. But I knew they were bluffing. In the meantime, I continued with my life, secure in the knowledge that I had done everything right. I checked the cameras regularly, just in case anyone tried to trespass again. I also reached out to some of my neighbors who had been using my property as a shortcut. Surprisingly, some of them apologized and promised they would never use the road again. Others seemed indifferent, but at least I knew I wasn't entirely alone in this. Then one day, while I was out running errands, I received a call from my lawyer. Apparently, Karen had contacted a lawyer of her own and was planning to take me to court. She claimed that the HOA had authorized the road as a public access point and that I had violated some sort of community easement by blocking it. My lawyer quickly assured me that there was no such easement in place and that the HOA had no legal standing in the matter. It was nothing but an attempt to bully me into removing the gate. Still, Karen's persistence was getting under my skin. I knew that the legal battle could drag on, and I wasn't prepared to waste my time and money on it. So, I decided to take one more step to ensure I was fully protected. I reached out to a local news station that specialized in property rights and HOA issues, hoping to shed some light on what was really happening here. I sent them a brief outline of the situation, along with photos of my property, the fence, and the letter from the HOA. To my surprise, they responded quickly and wanted to do an interview. A few days later, I found myself sitting in front of a camera, explaining how the HOA was overstepping its bounds and how I was simply trying to protect my private property. The news team was supportive, and I made sure to mention how I had gone through all the proper legal channels to make sure my actions were legitimate. I also talked about the HOA's track record of ignoring residents' concerns and prioritizing their own agenda over the needs of the community. The interview aired on local news that evening, and the response was overwhelming. The following week, Karen called again, but this time, she wasn't as forceful. In fact, she seemed almost apologetic. "I saw the news," she said, "and I realize I may have overreacted." She told me that after seeing the coverage, some of her neighbors had spoken out against her and the HOA's tactics. She admitted that the HOA had no real claim to the land and that she had been too aggressive in trying to force me to change my property. She apologized for the way she had acted. I was stunned. This wasn't the Karen I had dealt with weeks earlier. I wasn't about to forgive her completely, but I could tell she had realized the error of her ways. It was an unexpected turn of events, and it seemed like the whole situation was finally coming to a close. Shortly after the news interview, I received a formal letter from the HOA. They apologized for their involvement and confirmed that they would no longer pursue any action against me. They also issued a reminder to the residents that they must respect private property and avoid trespassing on others' land. Karen, according to the letter, had been advised to step down from the board, but they didn't go into specifics. It felt like a victory not just for me, but for anyone who had been bullied by an HOA in the past. I had stood my ground, fought back when necessary, and in the end, I had my rights respected. The road was still blocked, the gate was still up, and my property was finally safe from intruders. A few months passed, and the HOA moved on to other matters. Karen, thankfully, was nowhere to be seen, and I was left in peace. It was a strange experience, and looking back on it, I realized how much of a battle it had been. From the first signs of trespassing to the heated confrontation with Karen, all the way through the HOA meetings and legal threats, I had learned a lot about property rights and the power struggle that can happen when someone tries to impose their will on others. I still get some occasional questions from neighbors who ask about the fence, but most have accepted the situation. The HOA hasn't bothered me since that last letter, and for the first time in a long while, I can honestly say I feel at peace with my property. Sometimes, I still catch a glimpse of someone driving down the main road and wonder if they ever regret using that shortcut. But one thing is certain. They'll never be able to take my property from me again.